Welcome to the NABS Now podcast, brought to you by the National Association of Blind Students, a proud division of the National Federation of the Blind.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into the NABS Now podcast. I'm your host, Nina, and today we're going to be talking about legislation and how you can enact change as a student. While we all have a lot going on in our lives between working and academics and other things that we are a part of, legislation is very important, even though it can seem daunting as a student. So today we're going to be hearing from two very special guests, Kenia Flores and Justin Salisbury, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves and tell you their thoughts on legislation and the experiences that they have had.
Aloha, this is Justin Mark Hideaki Salisbury, the Legislative Advocacy Committee Chair for the National Association of Blind Students. I am in Honolulu, Hawaii, and I am between a master's degree in teaching the blind from Louisiana Tech University. I'm a cane travel instructor, and my PhD. I want to get my PhD in education and learn more, study more, and help prepare future generations of educators. So that's my big dream, and that's why I'm still a student, still active in the student space.
So in a few moments, our students are going to get to hear an interview that you conducted with the Lieutenant Governor of Hawaii. And I was wondering if you'd be able to give them a little bit of background as to the story behind that interview.
Absolutely. So Lieutenant Governor Josh Green is a good friend of mine and has been for years, since before he was Lieutenant Governor. He is a really cool guy because he really takes the time to listen and understand and learn about disability rights and what matters to us. And a lot of times when we as blind people, we hear, oh, you got to go talk to this legislator who is an expert on healthcare. We think, oh, that's the death of whatever we need, because then they want to medicalize our blindness. Well, he didn't do that. He actually took the time to listen to us and to learn, and it was really great. And then we developed a great friendship, and he started learning about other things that we needed and started helping us, and it was great. And so I worked very actively, very hard on his campaign to make sure that we could put him in the position of Lieutenant Governor. And so he actually was really generous and gave some time during the height of the campaign to sit down with me over lunch at his condo, and we were able to do some recording. We were able to talk about some of these concepts to help teach blind students, to help educate a future generation of advocates and activists, and he wants to support that. So that was really great.
All right, welcome to a podcast on legislation with the National Association of Blind Students and, of course, the National Federation of the Blind. My name is Justin Salisbury. I'm the president of the Hawaii Association of Blind Students and an active member of the National Federation of the Blind affiliate here in Hawaii. I'm here with a friend of mine, Senator Josh Green, also known as an emergency room medical doctor and a medical director here in Hawaii. He wears a lot of hats, but he knows a lot about legislation and how the state government and federal government works. So I've invited him to join us here on this podcast today. You want to say hi?
Hi, I so appreciate being a part of this, Justin. It's my pleasure to share my experience.
Awesome. So what I'd like to do is, because Josh has done a lot of work with us. Is it all right if I call you that on the podcast? Okay,
absolutely.
Great. So he's done a lot of work with us in the Federation over the past year or so, and I wanted to just kind of tell some stories about how we've worked together, and I'll give some definitions in order to make it palatable for people. So a committee is basically a subset of a given body of anything really, but with regard to a legislature, it's a smaller group of senators or representatives that deals with a certain topic or issue or content area. And then a subcommittee, which we don't have any of those in Hawaii, but at the federal level, and maybe in some states, you can have a smaller version of that focuses in an even more narrow way. And then anything a subcommittee decides gets referred back to a committee and then back to its whole body before something goes on. Now, when I met Josh, it was across a hearing room table because he was chair of a committee called the Senate Committee on Human Services here in Hawaii. So anything you want to add with your experience on what the committees do?
Well, the committees are responsible to take up the legislation, and so the committee chairs are ultimately responsible to look at all the bills that have been have been referred to them, that have been submitted by colleagues, by other legislators, they get sifted out and referred to the proper subject material committee. So a health bill goes to the health committee, a human services bill goes to the human services committee, and so on, often many committees. And then once that process has been completed, it's really up to the chairpeople, the chairman or chairwoman, to decide whether there's going to be a hearing. So in Hawaii, at least, the chairs have a lot of latitude to decide what does or doesn't go forward for a hearing. And of course, if we want to pass laws, we got to get them through the whole hearing process in first the Senate, and then the House, and then work things out. So you rely on your chairs in general. Hopefully they have some expertise in the area to work with people, work with organizations, and begin the process of passing a bill.
Excellent, thank you. So it's a good segue into the whole concept of a hearing, which of course is how we met. So, when a bill needs to get discussed, or maybe there's an investigation going on or some kind of briefing, it can be called to what we call a hearing, where then the chair of the committee is usually the one running the show and actually calling people up so that they can testify and speak on it. There's usually written testimony submitted ahead of time. And of course, the opportunity where we met, there was somebody pushing a bill that was actually going to hurt disability rights. A bunch of people with an agency that profits off of selling an image of blind people as helpless was trying to ask for something that was really going to hurt us. And so we went into that hearing and we spoke up and we testified against it. And a lot of people, including Senator Green, took the time to listen to what we were saying. And then he came out after the hearing to talk with us and said, hey, I totally get where you guys are coming from. I'm going to kill this thing for you. But, also in the future, come tell me what you do need. So with that, I want to give you another chance, Josh, if you want to offer anything about what hearings are like and maybe how they go.
Sure. So once a bill gets in front of a chair, then it's all bets are off, kind of. You just don't know exactly what might happen. Testimony begins to come in both for and against a bill. In my case, I tend to hear a lot of legislation so that I can learn about issues and vet what's good or bad on a subject. The example that you remind us of was a bill about whether or not individuals who are blind should or shouldn't be given access to handicap parking and access to use that those facilities. A very compelling case was made in your case by you and some others and many others that we wanted to fight to strengthen people's resolve who are blind, to empower them, that we didn't want to disempower a large group of people. And I took it to heart, and after hearing a lot of testimony on both sides, thought that the bill shouldn't go forward. And that's ideally the way a hearing should go. A lot of times, of course, hearings have a different kind of life. A lot of times people have a preordained decision. They already have predetermined what they'd like to do in the committee, and that's unfortunate. But I like to approach it a different way, which is to really try to listen to people and see what's right.
Thank you. And yeah, one thing that was really cool in that hearing is we actually heard other agencies within the state citing a resolution that was passed by the National Federation of the Blind years before, saying that blind people didn't need to get handicap parking. And that was really quite interesting to see the work of the Federation even being cited by other entities across our state that were on our side. After we built that initial relationship, then I remember Shannon Cantan and I were at a cookout at the Bishop Museum, and we had all kinds of people there, and I saw Josh and we were talking, and I said, hey, there is this one thing that would really help us, here in Hawaii, if someone thinks that a blind person shouldn't be raising kids, then they can just take them away. And we would like to pass a bill that would make it so that, blind people do have the right to raise our own kids. And he said, oh my God, of course, I'll help with that. I'll introduce it. And as the chair on the Senate Committee on Human Services, he was able to take our model bill and work it up the way that it would fit Hawaii. And then we had a bill. And then it was a matter of taking it to hearings. So of course, actually while we were at Washington Seminar, Shannon and I both were, and a number of us were at Washington Seminar, we were still able to put together a hearing because we knew we could trust that Josh as committee chair would do his part, and the Federationists who stayed behind were ready to go and testified well. So we had a hearing, we passed the bill through without doing anything to change it. So in other words, we'd say no markup. But sometimes a bill maybe needs some editing or some markup where people are making adjustments, making some edits, some changes. And so, you know, that's a role that's often played frequently by a committee chair. So I'm wondering, Josh, if you could tell us a little bit about how markup goes for you. Sometimes good, maybe sometimes bad, how maybe it gets interpreted by people.
Sure. So if a bill does have enough merit to go forward in the process, but needs some fundamental change, even some just basic grammatical changes, we do that. But if it needs fundamental changes, we work with the bill writing agencies, usually the Senate Majority Office or the Legislative Writing Bureau. We take recommendations from people's testimony, and we try to incorporate them in the bill to go on to the next committee. Then we vote on it, usually in committee with amendments, and the amendments get finalized, and then it goes to the subsequent committees, and then it's got to go through the same process again. Once it has done that, once we've gotten things tuned up a bit, of course it's not done then, it goes to the other body, and the House has to go through the exact same process. Ideally, in the conference committee, if both House and Senate pass it, the language matches up very cleanly, and we can simply get a bill over to the governor. If it doesn't, it has to go through final amendments or markups like you described, and that can be a contentious process. So there's a lot that goes into it, but really it's just like editing a school paper or a document that one might do in their job. It just has to be voted on afterwards.
Great. Yeah, so that brings up another closely related topic that is also on our agenda here to talk about, and that's conference committee. Now, one thing that we've talked about a lot here in Hawaii is a bill that died in conference committee. That was our bill to end subminimum wages. Now, because of different committee memberships and chairmanships, Josh had actually done a lot of work to broker us a bill to end subminimum wages, but then a chair of another committee said, I want this to be my bill so that I can put it through, and so it ended up being somebody else who took the bill and introduced it. But eventually, there were different forms of markup and different versions that got passed by different committees and by each chamber. So then we got to what's called conference committee, where you have representatives from each chamber, some people from the House and some people from the Senate, who are appointed to iron out those differences. And so then at the end of this process of negotiating and everything, there's a bill that comes out that's the big final one that gets voted on by both chambers. So I'm curious, in your experience, Josh, what's it like to be on a conference committee?
Well, conference committee is an interesting beast. It's good to be on a conference committee if you're the lead chair, because if you're the lead chair, you're responsible for most of the decisions and all of the edits and amendments. You still need to have your chairs on board with you, but the way we do it is any committee that saw or heard the bill, that chair ends up on the conference committee. Usually that's at least 3 people. And then we'll usually put another couple on that have been interested in the bill. Maybe they were the sponsor of the bill, or someone from the minority party when we had someone. We don't have any Republicans in the Hawaii State Senate, so we don't have that issue right now. But usually we keep an odd number so a vote can be handled. And if you're not the chair of the conference committee, you really have a very quiet, relaxed role. It'd probably be better to have more input, and I'm sure every state does things differently, but in Hawaii at least, the chairs of the conference committee pretty much determine its fate. And then you just have to hope that the chair of the House and the chair of the Senate are able to work together, because if they're not, a bill's fate could be quite unfortunate.
Excellent. Well, great. So, I mean, we've talked about a lot of these things at the state level. I know in pretty much every way it's a mirror image of what happens at the federal level. Are there any major differences that you notice between the state and federal levels on the topics we've discussed?
Well, the state and the federal levels have some fundamental differences and some similarities. We both have bicameral legislatures, meaning House and Senate, so we have to go through the same kind of process. Of course, we both have an executive branch to navigate, again, a process that you have to understand is right there for you. We don't see a lot of vetoes in the state of Hawaii. There are a few occasionally, but At the federal level, a lot more of that because there's a lot more partisanship. We do have a small state with a much smaller budget, so we have to be mindful of what programs we can afford. But there are other, all the other similarities exist. You have to go through the whole process. We don't have subcommittees, as you mentioned. Subcommittees is just a way for them to describe multiple committees. We have a lot of committees. Used to be that health and human services were together, for instance, and the human services side was often managed by another vice chair or looked into it. You could have looked at that as a subcommittee. Now we have a full committee for human services. So really, the principles are the same. There's just a little bit of nuance here and there.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be on this podcast with us here. Did you have anything more that you wanted to offer or say in closing?
Well, I just think that you guys should be very proud of the effort that you put into the process. I've seen an incredible amount of well-informed testimony coming from your organization, thoughtful people, passionate people. You do a very good job of making it a human question with very humanizing stories. As a legislator, I can tell you, if people can bring some emotion to the table and tell real stories, real human life impacts of what legislation would mean or make, that makes a big difference. And just being intelligent and well-informed and ready for hearings also goes a long way. So I commend you guys, you in particular, Justin. You've been exceptional in my opinion. And having a team of people that are ready to come and contribute is also very valuable. You never want to be alone. You want to be able to fortify your position with a few other testifiers and be ready on your feet, because curveballs come all the time, as we've seen, even from people we would think would be our allies, like a Department of Labor person or someone from the Attorney General's office. So always come better informed than they can possibly be ready for their questions or their curveballs, and you will often prevail. It takes a little time. Always be ready for 2, 3, 4 years at least to pass a piece of legislation. Never consider it a failure if it's not done in the first year. But you can succeed if you're as accomplished as your group has been.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And as we say in Hawaii, mahalo and aloha.
That was a great informative interview with Lieutenant Governor Josh Green. Thank you so much, Justin, for all of your contributions. And now we're going to talk to Kenia Flores, who is the second vice president of NABS and who also has a great bit of experience in legislation and advocating.
Hey y'all, my name is Kenia Flores, and I'm the second vice president of the National Association of Blind Students, and I'm a senior at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm majoring in politics and international affairs, and eventually want to go to law school.
We're so excited to have you with us today, Kenia. The first question I want to ask you is, what type of advocating have you been involved in as a student?
I'd say that most of my advocacy efforts have been with the NFB. I attended my first Washington seminar when I was 17 and a senior in high school. And honestly, I'd say that it's probably one of the most impactful experiences that I've had thus far. I think it's hard to really know at that point in your life sort of what you're going to do and what direction you're headed in, with so many pressures from everybody around you and like the college application process and everything like that. And I think for me, it was just kind of one of those moments where it hit me that this was bigger than myself, and I was one person out of 500 federationists, but we were all advocating together for legislative priorities and really communicating to members of Congress what we do and don't need. And since then, I've continued to stay involved and go to Washington seminar and advocate. But it has also prompted me to get more involved with politics in general. On my university's campus, I help with an initiative called Dins Vote, which encourages students to vote. I'm not sure if many of y'all know this, but unfortunately, people in the age range of 18 to 26 are least likely to vote, which is really sad because like research shows that you're more likely to continue voting if you form a habit of it early. And so I really like, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, I really encourage everybody to register to vote. If you need help or don't know where to turn, please reach out. I'd be more than happy to help you do that, because it's so important. These numbers represent you and your interests, and I know it's hard to say, like, oh, I'm really unsatisfied with this policy. And one of my first questions to people is, do you vote? Because if you don't, I mean, that makes it a little bit harder for you to argue that your interests aren't being represented.
So I just want to elaborate. You said that it's really important for students to register to vote. Similarly, why do you think it's important for our students, especially our blind students, to get involved with advocating for legislation?
That's such a good question. So I would say that we are in a very unique position because not only are we still in school, but we're also just kind of entering the working world and are sort of really experiencing a lot firsthand. But there are things that members of Congress and even people on the state and local level don't understand. Excuse me. And that's something that we can all kind of help explain. But I think that there are certain experiences that people wouldn't know about just from listening to others relay an experience. So by that, I mean that if you're in a class that has inaccessible materials, you couldn't really expect someone who's never been to college to talk about these things. Um, I took a political analysis class in my sophomore year as part of my major, and we had to use an inaccessible software. Um, but unless I've experienced that, like no one else would know. And so there's nobody else better to communicate our needs than ourselves.
And one more question for you, Kenya. What advice would you give to a student if they're super hesitant to get involved in advocating for legislation? Because it does seem kind of scary when you're first starting out, and I know I felt that way. And what would you say to those students about getting involved?
That's such a good question. I wish that I would have paused and considered this before I sort of got started. Um, I would honestly say to take it one step at a time. I know legislation can be very overwhelming considering the amount of jargon and really complicated, pieces to legislation. Um, but I would just say read it again, read it again. Reach out to people who you know are more knowledgeable than you, because as someone who really enjoys politics and public policy as my major, and as someone who has interned both in the district and on Capitol Hill, I still have questions, and I don't think that it's a thing where you ever stop learning. I think it's more of reach out to those people around you, and even if it's like, hey, I don't understand how a bill becomes a law, like reach out to somebody. Our legislative advocacy committee would be more than happy to go over those points with you, or our affiliates or chapters. Anybody would be happy to help you.
Thank you so much, Kenya. We really appreciate your input.
Thank you so much, Kenya, Justin, and Lieutenant Governor Green. I really appreciate all of your hardworking contributions to this episode. I think that everyone has a lot to learn from you guys about advocating and enacting policy change. As for students, I hope that this inspires you to get more involved advocating and with legislation, and to maybe even join our legislative committee.